Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases preserved in the margins of rural American record-keeping. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We track where these documented accounts land and when. Some stories arrive like weather. Others arrive like warnings. This one arrived as a map. And then, like so many things that become inconvenient to keep, it stopped existing. In the summer of 1916, in a county where the courthouse still smelled of limestone dust and damp paper, a sheriff placed a single sheet onto a deputy's desk and told him to copy it by hand before the ink dried. The sheet was not a warrant, not a notice, not a confession. It was a field map, drawn in a steady pencil line, showing a route into the timber and the position of a structure labeled in two words that did not belong in any official document: Bone House. The reason this case survives at all is not because anyone intended it to. The county never printed a circular. No newspaper ran a formal account that could be saved as a clipping. There is no proud plaque and no commemorative photograph. What remains is a chain of administrative artifacts: a ledger entry with an abnormal inventory item, a budget request denied twice and approved once, a property seizure report with no property listed, and a map that appears in the records as an attachment for exactly 3 days before it disappears from the file, while the file itself remains. If you have watched these kinds of stories long enough, you start to recognize the pattern. The most dangerous evidence is often the most ordinary: a signed form, a stapled page, a line that should not be in a book. The first trace comes from a routine quarterly report submitted by the sheriff's office to the county commissioners, the kind of paperwork designed to be unread and still obeyed. It listed expenses for fuel, ammunition, replacement shackles, 2 new lanterns, and a final item written smaller than the rest, as though the writer expected the ink itself to object: cartography services, 1 day. In 1916, rural law enforcement did not purchase cartography services unless the state was involved, or the terrain was unfamiliar, or there was something in the woods that required being found twice. The next document in the chain is a thin carbon copy of a letter addressed to a state forestry office requesting a surveyor to assist with an unauthorized structure of significant public concern. The letter contains no description. It is formal, restrained, and unusually careful in its language. It does not name the structure. It does not name the materials. It does not name the reason. It simply requests expertise and suggests urgency. A clerk stamped it received. No response is attached. 2 weeks later, the sheriff's office logs record the arrival of a man whose name appears nowhere else in county books, a temporary consultant paid in cash from a discretionary line item. His official role is written as draftsman. That word can mean many things. In practice, it meant someone who could turn terrain into lines, and lines into directions that other men could follow without question. It is at this point that the sheriff's map enters the story, not as an artifact we can hold, but as an absence we can measure. In the case file index, under a folder title that appears generic enough to survive routine purges, there is a note: Attachment A, Field Map. In the inventory list created when the folder was transferred between offices, Attachment A is present. When the folder is logged out for review 3 days later, Attachment A is no longer present. And yet a deputy's handwritten copy of the map survives elsewhere, folded into a pocket ledger that would not have been considered part of the official record. It is a smaller map, less precise, but the handwriting matches the deputy's known samples, and the annotations are copied faithfully from the original. This is how many histories survive, not in the place they are supposed to be, but in the place someone forgot to check. The deputy's copy begins with a simple starting point: a bridge, a split in a creek, a logging road that used to exist and no longer does. Then a series of measurements that sound like the language of surveying rather than police work: paces, angles, a note about elevation, and a note about a stand of trees that should be avoided because the ground gives. At the center, marked with a rectangle, is the destination, Next to it is a caution written with different pressure, as though the pencil was held tighter. Do not enter alone. In the corner, a date, July 19, 1916, and a signature that should not have been on a map at all, the sheriff's name. A map like that is not simply a guide. It is a confession of procedure. It implies the sheriff went there first. It implies he saw enough to believe returning was necessary. It implies he believed others would need the route even if he did not return to show them. The official events begin the next morning. The deputy's duty log records that the sheriff left the station before dawn with 2 deputies, 1 volunteer tracker, and a single county-issued camera that had previously been used only for accident scenes and property seizures. The log notes the weather. It notes that the men carried extra rope. It notes that they carried lime. Lime is not standard equipment for a routine patrol. Lime is used for sanitation. Lime is used for concealment. Lime is used when you expect a smell. At 7:40 a.m., the station operator wrote that the group was en route as per map. At 2:10 p.m., there is a second note, no contact. Returned party minus the sheriff. The log does not explain that phrase. It does not say where they returned from. It does not say how. It does not say what was found. It does not say why the sheriff was not with them. It simply marks that the party returned and the sheriff did not. In the days that follow, the paper trail tightens. There are requests for additional patrols. There is a note about restricting access to a portion of county timberland under the pretense of a fire risk. There is an invoice for extra nails and boards, the kind used to seal an opening quickly. There is a short written statement from one deputy, taken in the manner of a deposition, that is both detailed and strangely empty. It describes a path into the woods that seemed to rearrange itself on the way back. It describes a clearing that was too clean. It describes a structure that could not be a hunting cabin because there was no evidence of hunting. It describes an absence of animals and an absence of birdsong. It does not describe what the structure was made of. Instead, it repeats the same phrase 3 times, as if the writer believed repetition could replace the missing noun. Not wood, not stone, not skin. Not wood, not stone, not skin. Then the statement ends with a line that reads less like testimony and more like instruction. The map must be kept separate. The deputy's hand shakes in the final words, visible even in the pressure of the strokes. That is what makes this case different from a simple disappearance. It isn't just that a man vanished in the woods, which happened often enough in 1916 to be accepted as tragedy. It is that the disappearance generated an administrative reaction that suggests containment. A map was drawn, copied, separated, and then removed. A structure was located, approached, and then treated as something that should not become public knowledge. The sheriff, who was supposed to be the authority in the county, becomes a missing person inside his own jurisdiction, and the first thing the office does is not to search, but to manage paper. If you want to understand what happened next, you have to follow the records the way the deputies did. Slowly, carefully, and with the knowledge that something in the file is already missing. In rural counties of that era, authority was not abstract. It was embodied. When the sheriff disappeared, the system did not pause. It redistributed his weight. An acting sheriff was appointed by the county commissioners in a closed session whose minutes record nothing beyond the vote itself. No discussion, no objections. The entry is as thin as possible while still being legal. On the same day, the clerk created a new folder inside the original case file. Its title is deliberately vague, Timber Inquiry. That phrasing matters. It reframes the problem from a missing official to a land issue, from a human absence to a resource concern. This is the first documented pivot away from the man and toward the place. Inside that folder is a copy of the deputy's statement, but it has been altered, not rewritten, redacted. Certain phrases are crossed through with a single line, not heavy, not angry, just enough to render them unofficial. The repeated phrase describing the structure's material remains untouched, perhaps because the editor did not know how to replace it. But the final instruction about the map has been neatly struck out, as if it had never been written. This edited version is the one that survives in the county archive. The unedited one exists only because the deputy kept his pocket ledger. Meanwhile, the forest itself becomes quieter in the records. Patrol routes are adjusted. A new boundary appears on internal maps that does not correspond to any deed or public notice. It is labeled simply as a restricted zone due to unsafe ground conditions. No geological survey is attached. No incident is cited. The restriction exists because someone with authority said it should, and once written, it becomes fact. This is how administrative reality is created, not by proof, but by repetition. The acting sheriff submits a request to the county board for funds to reinforce an abandoned structure found during the initial patrol. Again, no description, just reinforcement. The request is denied. He submits it again the following week with a different justification: hazard mitigation. This time, it is approved. The approval note includes a condition that the work be conducted quietly and without outside contractors. The county did not want witnesses. A work crew composed of jail trustees and 2 deputies is assembled. Their names appear on a payroll sheet that has no corresponding task description. They are paid for 3 days of labor in the timber. Only one of those men ever speaks about it again, decades later, and only in fragments recorded by his granddaughter after his death. But before we reach that, there is another artifact that complicates the timeline: the sheriff's personal effects. His badge is logged, his revolver is logged, his notebook is logged, but his map is not. There is a note stating that his field materials were accounted for except for items previously inventoried. This circular phrasing references the map without naming it. It allows the inventory to be technically complete while still missing the most important object. The deputy who copied the map is reassigned to a distant precinct within the county under the justification of balancing manpower. His ledger goes with him. That is why it survives. The work crew reaches the site on the morning of July 24. According to the timesheets, they spend the first day clearing brush and stabilizing the ground. The second day is listed as construction. The third day is listed as sanitation. That word appears again: sanitation. Lime is requisitioned a second time, more than the first. No one files a smell complaint, but the requisition suggests that one existed. When the crew returns, they are quieter than before. One deputy requests leave without explanation. Another requests a transfer. The trustees sign affidavits stating they completed their assigned labor and observed nothing unusual. The affidavits are identical down to the punctuation. Someone wrote them for them. The next document in the file is a simple line added to the county map registry: structure removed. No coordinates, no permit, no date, just a statement of absence. Whatever had been there was now officially not. And yet the forest does not comply. Hunters begin reporting difficulty navigating familiar trails. A logging foreman files a complaint that a section of his planned cut cannot be accessed because the ground does not behave normally. His phrasing is corrected in the final version of the complaint to read unstable soil, conditions. Language is doing work again, sanding down meaning until it fits a form. The acting sheriff orders the original map destroyed. That order appears in a memo that exists only as a reference in another memo acknowledging its execution. The map itself is not attached. You cannot destroy what you no longer have, but the order stands anyway. This creates a legal fiction in which the problem has been solved. By late August, the case was effectively closed without ever being opened to the public. The sheriff is declared missing, presumed dead due to misadventure in difficult terrain. His family receives a letter that is careful and compassionate and empty. There is nobody. There is no recovery. There is no mention of a structure, There is no map. The forest returns to the category of background, but the deputy's copy of the map remains folded in his ledger, and the ledger acquires a second annotation months later. A single line added in the margin, written more lightly than the rest, as if the writer did not want it to be noticed. The structure is no longer where it was. The phrasing is odd. It does not say destroyed. It does not say removed. It no longer says where it was. That implies movement rather than absence. This is where the case stops being about what happened in 1916 and starts being about what refused to stay put. From late 1916 through the early 1920s, the county ledgers show nothing that appears connected to the sheriff's disappearance or the structure he mapped. Patrols continue. Timber is sold. Roads are graded. The restricted zone remains, its boundary redrawn once to accommodate a new survey, but never explained. This is how unresolved events are preserved inside systems that cannot admit uncertainty, by allowing them to become background conditions. Yet absence has a way of attracting attention, especially from people whose work depends on predictability. In 1923, a new assessor, unfamiliar with the county's unwritten rules, begins reconciling property valuations against physical landmarks. He notices a discrepancy, a section of land consistently valued lower than adjacent parcels, despite no recorded reason. No flood, no fire, no slope, instability. Just a quiet reduction that has been carried forward year after year without explanation. He writes a note in the margin asking why. The answer he receives is verbal, not written, and therefore does not survive. But his follow-up does. A formal request for clarification that triggers a review of old files. This is the first time in 7 years that the original folder has been opened again. When it is, several things are missing that should not be. The attachment list references items that are no longer there. The index numbers skip. A clerk writes a small question mark next to one entry and then draws a line through it. The review concludes quickly with a memo stating that the valuation reflects historical hazard considerations. Again, language steps in to do the work that explanation cannot. The assessor is told to accept it and move on. He does, but not before making a personal copy of the old boundary map, which he keeps with his working papers. That copy becomes important later. The next anomaly enters through the back door of routine maintenance. In 1928, a road crew tasked with repairing a washed-out culvert near the edge of the restricted zone files a report that includes an unusual observation. The ground beneath their equipment behaved unpredictably. Stakes would not hold. Measurements taken in the morning did not align with those taken in the afternoon. The report is initially dismissed as poor surveying, but when the crew returns the following week, they find markers they had placed no longer align with the terrain. One marker is gone entirely. Another is found several yards away, embedded at an angle that suggests it was pushed rather than pulled. The supervisor amends the report to remove speculation, but the original version survives as a carbon copy misfiled among receipts. This is how the case continues to breathe, through errors, through copies, through things that end up where they were not meant to be. By the early 30s, the forest around the old boundary had developed a reputation. Not a story, exactly, more like a hesitation. Hunters avoid it. Loggers reroute around it without asking why. It becomes a place where work takes longer and tools fail more often. These things are not written down because they are not events, they are conditions. The sheriff's map, or rather the idea of it, resurfaces in 1933 when the deputy who copied it dies. His effects are inventoried by his daughter, who finds the pocket ledger tucked inside a coat. She does not understand the map, but she recognizes its care. She takes it to the courthouse, assuming it belongs there. The clerk on duty accepts it, signs a receipt, and then does something unusual. He does not file it. Instead, he places it in his desk drawer and keeps it there until his retirement. No notation is made, no index updated. The map becomes unofficial again, existing only because someone did not know where it was supposed to go. When the clerk retires in 1949, the contents of his desk are cleared by a junior employee who finds the map folded and brittle. By then, the landmarks no longer match current roads. Bridges have been replaced, creeks rerouted, but the core geometry remains. The employee asks a supervisor what to do with it. The supervisor looks at it for a long time and then tells him to put it back where he found it. That instruction is not followed. Instead, the employee slips the map into a personnel file scheduled for off-site storage, assuming it will be forgotten. It is, but it is not destroyed. In 1957, a graduate student researching county governance during the early 20th century requests access to those storage files. He is interested in administrative continuity. He finds the map by accident. Unlike the others, he has no stake in the county's comfort. He traces the route using modern topographic charts and notes something unsettling. The destination marked on the map does not correspond to a single fixed point. Depending on the scale used, it appears to drift. At some resolutions, it aligns with the old restricted zone. At others, it appears several hundred yards away, sometimes entirely outside it. He writes a short note in his research journal. The map references a location that behaves like a moving target. He never publishes this observation. His thesis focuses on budgetary reform, but he keeps the note. By the 60s, the forest had changed again. New growth covers old clearings, roads shift, the restricted zone shrinks on public maps, though it never disappears entirely. And then, in 1964, a state inspection team arrives to audit county land use. They request all historical documentation related to restricted areas. The county provides a sanitized packet. It does not include the map. It does not include the deputy's original statement. It does not include the sanitation invoices. The inspectors sign off anyway. Officially, nothing remains to investigate. Unofficially, the pattern has already established itself. The structure that was mapped and removed does not behave like a building. It behaves like a recurrence. It appears, provokes documentation, and then withdraws, leaving behind adjustments rather than evidence. The sheriff's disappearance becomes the first entry in a sequence that the county never names but continues to respond to. The map, wherever it is, remains the most dangerous object in the file because it suggests intent. Someone went there. Someone drew a route. Someone believed it could be found again. And if a thing can be found again, it can return. By the late 60s, the county no longer treats the old restricted area as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be managed. This shift is subtle, visible only if you read the paperwork closely. Earlier documents ask questions. Later ones issue instructions. Patrols are no longer sent to investigate reports near the boundary. Instead, they are redirected. Maintenance requests are approved only if they do not require extended presence. Surveyors are advised to rely on existing benchmarks rather than place new ones. None of this is framed as secrecy. It is framed as efficiency. Over time, efficiency becomes indistinguishable from avoidance. In 1969, a flood alters several creeks in the county, forcing a revision of drainage maps. The hydrology team notes an inconsistency near the old zone. Water flow behaves normally upstream and downstream, but within a narrow band, readings fluctuate unpredictably. The report recommends further study. The recommendation is acknowledged and never acted upon. Instead, the land is marked as unstable terrain and excluded from future projects. This is the same solution applied again, refined by experience. Do not fix what can be bypassed. In 1972, a new sheriff takes office. He is young enough not to remember his predecessor's disappearance as anything more than a story told by older deputies. He requests a review of unresolved cases as part of a modernization effort. The file surfaces again. Thinner now, sanitized, but still incomplete in ways that are difficult to explain. He notices that the case lacks a final disposition order, a technical omission that should not exist. He asks a clerk to locate it. The clerk cannot. He asks an archivist. The archivist produces a memo stating that certain early files were reorganized during a previous records consolidation and that some materials were deemed redundant. Redundant is the word used when something cannot be explained but must still be removed. The sheriff considers reopening the matter, but is advised against it by the county attorney, who frames the issue as one of liability. Revisiting the case could expose the county to questions about land use, improper restrictions, or failure to recover a missing official. Better to leave it settled. The sheriff accepts this advice, but he does one thing quietly. He orders a current map of the county overlaid with historical boundaries, including the old restricted zone. When the layers are combined, an odd pattern emerges. The boundary does not align consistently across decades. It shifts slightly, as if tracking something beneath it rather than defining something above. The sheriff does not write this observation down. He keeps the map rolled in his office closet. Around the same time, local stories begin to change. They do not mention bones or structures. Instead, they mention orientation. People getting turned around, hunters emerging hours later than expected, dogs refusing to cross certain lines. These accounts are dismissed publicly, but internally they reinforce a growing understanding that the place identified on the sheriff's map is not fixed. It behaves less like a location and more like an event. In 1978, a controlled burn is scheduled near the edge of the old zone to reduce wildfire risk. Fire crews report unexpected behavior. Flames move against the wind. Smoke settles unnaturally. One crew leader notes that the fire seems to skirt an invisible boundary, leaving a pocket untouched. The report includes a hand-drawn sketch. It is not included in the final filing. The area spared by the fire corresponds closely with one of the historical boundary variations. Again, the response is administrative. The burn plan is adjusted. The anomaly is categorized as microclimate variation. No follow-up occurs. By the 80s, the county had changed. Records are digitized. Old files are boxed and sent to storage. The physical archive becomes harder to navigate, and with that difficulty comes opportunity. In 1983, a junior archivist tasked with cataloging pre-war materials notices a pattern of missing attachments across several unrelated cases. All originate from the same decade. All involve land, structures, or restricted access. She writes a memo suggesting a review of record handling practices from that period. The memo is acknowledged and filed. Nothing else happens. But she keeps a list. Years later, after leaving the county, she donates her papers to a historical society. The list is among them. It includes the sheriff's case as its first entry. In 1989, a private landowner adjacent to the old zone applies for a permit to build a hunting cabin. The application is denied without explanation beyond environmental concerns. The landowner appeals. During the appeal, a surveyor notes that the proposed site does not align consistently with its coordinates when measured against older maps. The surveyor's report is technical, cautious, and difficult to parse. It suggests that the land itself has undergone subtle shifts not reflected in official records. The appeal is denied again. The landowner sells the parcel at a loss. By the time the century turns, the sheriff's disappearance has been reduced to a footnote in a county history pamphlet. A man lost in the woods. A reminder of the dangers of the job. The bone house is not mentioned. The map is not mentioned. The structure officially never existed. And yet, the behavior of the land continues to generate quiet workarounds. Policies are adjusted. Boundaries drift. Instructions are passed verbally rather than written. The case has achieved a kind of resolution that does not rely on truth. It relies on habit, but habits break when new eyes arrive. In 1998, a state-level audit mandates a review of all restricted land classifications older than 50 years. The county must justify each one or remove it. The old zone appears on the list. The justification is thin, hazard, unstable ground, historical precedent. The auditors request documentation. The county provides what it has. It is not enough. A site visit is scheduled. This is the first time in decades that an official team plans to walk the ground with the explicit purpose of understanding why it was avoided. The visit is set for early autumn, when the forest is most navigable. The date is chosen for efficiency. No one comments on the coincidence. The sheriff's map, wherever it is now, has waited longer. The audit team consists of 3 individuals: a surveyor, an environmental compliance officer, and a regional administrator whose role is largely procedural. None of them have grown up in the county. None of them have heard the stories in the way locals hear them, as hesitations rather than claims. They are accompanied by a county liaison whose job is to facilitate access and answer questions without volunteering information. The weather is clear. The forest appears cooperative. At first, the team parks at a turnout that did not exist when the sheriff drew his map, but which aligns closely enough with the old approach route to suggest continuity. The liaison notes that the restricted zone begins several hundred yards ahead, though there is no visible marker. The surveyor takes an initial reading. It matches expectations. They proceed. Within minutes, the environment begins to resist categorization. Measurements that should remain consistent require adjustment. Distances feel longer than they are recorded. The compliance officer notes a sudden drop in ambient sound, the kind of silence that is not absolute but directional, as if sound is being pulled away rather than suppressed. This observation does not make it into the official report. The surveyor places a temporary benchmark near what historical maps suggest is the edge of the zone. When he steps back to take a second reading, the benchmark is no longer where he placed it. It has not fallen. It has shifted, angled slightly, and embedded deeper than the soil should allow. He retrieves it without comment and places it again, this time marking the surrounding ground with chalk. The chalk marks fade within minutes, absorbed unevenly, as if the surface is damp beneath dry leaf litter. The team continues. At a point that does not correspond to any feature on modern maps, the surveyor's transit begins to behave erratically. The lens fogs despite low humidity, the bubble level drifts. He recalibrates twice. The readings stabilize briefly and then diverge again. The administrator asks how much longer the visit will take. The surveyor says he needs more time. The liaison suggests a break. They stop near a small clearing that feels unfinished, as though it were meant to be something else and never was. The compliance officer takes soil samples. The composition is unremarkable, nothing hazardous, nothing unstable. And yet, when the samples are bagged, the labels will later fail to match their contents. This discrepancy is discovered weeks later in a lab far from the forest. At the time, no one notices. The audit team does not find a structure. They do not find bones. They do not find anything that would justify decades of restriction. And yet, the visit does not conclude cleanly. As they retrace their path, the surveyor realizes that the route back does not match the route in. Landmarks appear out of order. A fallen log they stepped over earlier is now ahead of them again. The liaison insists they are moving correctly. The administrator checks his watch and notes that less time has passed than it feels like it should have. When they reach the turnout, the vehicle is exactly where it should be. Nothing appears wrong. And yet, the surveyor makes a decision he cannot later explain. He marks the site as indeterminate, not hazardous, not safe. Indeterminate. This classification allows the county to maintain the restriction without proving anything. It is a compromise that satisfies procedure while preserving avoidance. The audit report is filed. The restricted zone remains. But the visit has consequences. The surveyor, unsettled by the inconsistencies, requests access to historical records related to the area. He is given the sanitized packet. It does not satisfy him. He files a public records request for ancillary materials. This triggers a review by the county attorney, who denies the request on the grounds that the materials no longer exist. The surveyor accepts this officially and then does something unofficial. He contacts the Historical Society. This is where the archivist's donated list re-enters the story. The sheriff's case is there. The surveyor asks to see what remains. He is shown the footnotes, the references, and the gaps. He learns about the missing attachments. He learns about the deputy's ledger, though its location is unknown. He begins to understand that the absence itself is the point. In 2001, the surveyor returns on his own time. He does not notify the county. He does not bring equipment beyond a compass and a notebook. He enters the forest alone, something the original map explicitly warned against. He follows the historical route as best he can, triangulating between old and new landmarks. At a point that feels correct rather than precise, his compass begins to spin. He notes the time. He notes the weather. He notes the silence. He does not proceed further. Instead, he sketches the clearing he believes is forming ahead of him without stepping into it. The sketch is crude and incomplete, and yet unmistakably similar to the deputy's copy of the sheriff's map. He leaves. He never returns to that spot. Years later, after his death, his notebook is found among his effects. The page containing the sketch is torn. The tear is clean and deliberate. The page is missing. This is how the bonehouse persists. Not as a building, not as evidence, but as a recurring disruption in systems designed to be stable. It appears when someone insists on locating it and withdraws when documentation becomes possible. The sheriff's original act was not finding the structure. It was believing it could be fixed to a map. Everything that followed has been an attempt to undo that belief without admitting it was ever held. The next part of this story is not about what was found, but about what began to be anticipated. Because once a pattern is recognized, it changes how people behave, even when they refuse to name it. By the early 2000s, no one in the county government was actively searching for the structure the sheriff once mapped, but certain behaviors have become standardized in ways that suggest preparation rather than ignorance. Maintenance crews rotate assignments near the old zone more frequently than elsewhere. Survey requests that would require prolonged presence are quietly rerouted. Training materials for new deputies include an unremarkable line advising heightened caution in areas of historical instability without specifying what that instability entails. These adjustments are never linked to a single cause. They exist as a series of small accommodations, each defensible on its own, collectively forming a posture of avoidance. This is how institutions learn without admitting learning. In 2004, a wildfire burns through a large portion of the county's northern timberland. The fire behaves aggressively, consuming acres that had not burned in generations. When the smoke clears, aerial surveys reveal a curious irregularity. A pocket of forest within the fire's path remains untouched, an island of green surrounded by char. Fire ecologists attribute this to wind shifts and fuel variation, explanations that satisfy the report requirements, but not the map overlays. When the burn scar is compared to historical boundaries, the spared area aligns closely with one of the earlier variations of the restricted zone, not the current one. It is as if the land remembered an older outline. This observation is not included in the final analysis. The internal version of the report contains a handwritten note in the margin questioning the alignment. The note is unsigned. Around the same time, hikers begin reporting subtle disorientation near the edge of the burn scar. Not dramatic, not frightening, just wrong. Trails that should intersect do not. Distances feel inconsistent. One hiker files a complaint that his GPS track shows overlapping loops where none should exist. The complaint is answered with a form letter explaining signal interference in dense forest canopies. The hiker accepts this. He does not know that similar explanations have been used for decades to smooth over the same behavior. In 2007, a private researcher specializing in historical land anomalies contacts the county, requesting access to old survey data. His request is denied. He files a second request framed differently, focusing on infrastructure planning rather than anomalies. This one is partially approved. He receives redacted maps. He notices the drift. He notices the absence of fixed reference points. He publishes a paper that does not mention the county by name, describing a theoretical model in which certain locations resist stable representation, appearing to migrate when subjected to repeated measurement. The paper receives little attention. It is too abstract to alarm anyone, but someone in the county reads it. That same year, the Historical Society receives an anonymous donation, a single document, a copy of a map fragment, badly faded, showing a route that matches the deputy's copy but includes one additional notation. A small arrow pointing away from the destination, labeled simply "Later." No explanation accompanies the donation. The Society catalogs it without comment. In 2010, the county undertakes a comprehensive digitization of its archives. Boxes are scanned. Metadata is created. Old gaps become more visible because absence is harder to disguise in a database. A technician flags the sheriff's case because of inconsistent attachment references. The flag triggers a review. The review produces a recommendation to consolidate the file and remove redundant references to missing materials. This is done in the name of clarity. In practice, it erases the last formal acknowledgement that something is missing. The digital version of the file is cleaner than the physical one ever was. The case now appears complete because the record of its incompleteness has been removed. Meanwhile, on the ground, behavior continues to adjust. New signage appears on trails near the old zone, warning of unstable terrain and advising hikers to stay on marked paths. The signs are generic, but their placement follows a familiar pattern. Rangers are instructed to log any reports of unusual silence or navigational difficulty, not as incidents, but as environmental observations. These logs are reviewed quarterly and then archived without action. The effect is not investigation but normalization. The phenomenon, whatever it is being folded into routine. In 2014, a severe storm uproots several old trees near the boundary. When crews arrive to clear the damage, they discover a shallow depression beneath one of the roots, lined with stones arranged in a rectangular pattern. It is not deep. It does not resemble a foundation in any conventional sense. The stones are irregular and appear to have been placed at different times. The crew leader photographs it. The photos are reviewed by supervisors and deemed inconclusive. The stones are reburied during restoration. No report is filed. The depression does not appear on any map. But one worker keeps a copy of the photograph. Years later, he will say it felt less like finding something buried and more like interrupting something incomplete. The anticipation that now governs the county's response is not about the return of a building. It is about the return of attention. Every time someone insists on measuring, mapping, or explaining the area too closely, anomalies increase. When the area is left alone, the records settle. This pattern has been learned without ever being articulated. The sheriff's original mistake, if it can be called that, was not encountering the structure, it was formalizing it. He turned an event into a destination. The map made it repeatable. Everything since has been an effort to keep it from being repeatable again. And yet, repetition has a way of asserting itself. As the centennial of the sheriff's disappearance approaches, interest resurfaces quietly among those who study patterns rather than stories. They do not ask what the bone house was, they ask when it appears. They begin to look at dates rather than places. The records, sparse as they are, suggest intervals, not regular, not exact, but close enough to imply rhythm. The next part of this case follows that rhythm forward, into a period when the avoidance itself becomes harder to maintain. As the projected interval approaches, subtle changes appear in the administrative language surrounding the region. Requests that once received routine approvals now stall. Permits linger unsigned. Emails circulate, asking whether certain maintenance projects can be deferred to the following quarter without explanation. Nothing references a date directly, yet the timing is unmistakable when viewed against the earlier rhythm. What had previously been reactive now becomes anticipatory. The county does not announce a heightened alert. It does not issue memos. It simply slows down. In 2016, a temporary sheriff is appointed following an unexpected retirement. The appointment is meant to be brief, a caretaker until the next election. During his first weeks, he requests briefings on unresolved cases with lingering public interest. The Bonehouse file is not included. He discovers it only because he asks about the missing index numbers he notices while reviewing archive inventories. When the file is produced, he reads it as a historical oddity. He is not warned. No one tells him why the file feels thinner than it should. His interest is procedural, not personal. He schedules a site visit, more out of respect for thoroughness than belief. The visit is postponed twice due to weather. On the third attempt, he drives alone, ignoring a suggestion to bring an aide. The road conditions are unremarkable. The trail markers match current maps. He reaches the edge of the zone without incident. There is nothing to see. No structure. No clearing. Just forest. He takes photographs. He makes notes. He returns satisfied that the file can remain closed. 2 weeks later, he receives an anonymous envelope. Inside is a photocopy of his own site visit notes, annotated in a different hand. The annotations do not contradict his observations. They add to them. Distances he measured are marked as approximate. Compass bearings are circled with question marks. At the bottom of the page is a single sentence written smaller than the rest. You arrived too early. He does not report the letter. He does not know how. Instead, he locks the original file in his office drawer rather than returning it to archives. This act, small and private, mirrors the sheriff's choice a century earlier, a decision made without ceremony that alters the flow of record-keeping. Meanwhile, independent researchers begin to converge. They do not coordinate. They do not announce themselves. Each arrives for different reasons, drawn by fragments of information that seem unrelated until placed side by side. A geologist studying soil displacement patterns notes repeated minor subsidence in the same general area, always correcting itself within days. A sociologist researching rural rumor finds persistent narratives describing a place that does not stay put. An archivist notices references to structures that are never photographed but often described with unusual specificity. None of these researchers meet. Their findings exist in parallel, unconnected, like the paths on the old map. In the summer of 2017, a group of surveyors contracted for a broadband expansion inadvertently reintroduced fixed measurement into the area. Their equipment records discrepancies almost immediately. Signal delays. Looping coordinates. A marker placed at one location registers twice in the system. The technicians assume malfunction. They recalibrate. The anomalies persist. A supervisor orders the data flagged and set aside for later review. The review never occurs. The data is overwritten during a system update. The surveyors move on. But one technician, curious, keeps a personal log. He notes that the discrepancies peak at the same hour on 3 consecutive days. The hour corresponds to no known environmental factor. He shares this observation with a colleague who advises him to drop it. This is not how problems get solved here. By autumn, local awareness increases without becoming explicit. Longtime residents avoid the area instinctively. Newcomers receive advice framed as practicality rather than warning. Don't camp there. Trails aren't reliable. The weather turns fast. These explanations are sufficient. They require no belief. In October, on an anniversary unmarked by any official recognition, a hiker posts a photograph online. The image shows a line of stones protruding from the ground in a rough curve. The caption describes them as probably remnants of an old wall or fence. The location tag places them near the old zone. The photograph is unremarkable to most viewers. To those who know the file, it is unmistakable. The stones match the earlier depression found years before, now partially exposed. The post is deleted within hours. The hiker later claims he removed it because the attention made him uncomfortable. He does not mention the messages he received, asking him where exactly he took the photo and asking him to return. The county quietly sends a crew to the site. They find nothing. The stones are gone. The ground appears undisturbed. It is as if the exposure itself prompted correction. At this point, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Every attempt to document produces instability. Every retreat restores order. The phenomenon does not punish curiosity. It simply refuses to be held. The temporary sheriff begins to understand this without articulating it. He stops opening the drawer. He avoids the file. When his term ends, he leaves the office without transferring custody of the case. The file remains behind, locked and unofficial. In early 2018, a weather station installed near the boundary records repeated microbursts of pressure change. The data suggests brief vertical displacement, like air moving through a confined space that is not there. Meteorologists dismiss it as sensor error. The station is relocated. The anomalies stop. The replacement location produces clean data. The land has learned to redirect measurement. As the interval reaches its predicted midpoint, the county experiences a surge in minor incidents. Lost hikers found quickly, equipment failures, communication delays, none severe enough to trigger review. Collectively, they create friction. The system strains not because of catastrophe, but because of constant correction. This is the cost of containment. The bone house does not return as a building. It returns as a problem of timing, a question of when attention accumulates enough to invite manifestation. The sheriff's map made the mistake of anchoring it in space. The current challenge is anchoring it in time, and time, unlike land, is harder to fence. The next movement in this story is not driven by discovery but by convergence. Separate threads tightening toward the same moment without ever touching. The separate threads that had been running parallel begin to occupy the same narrow window, brushing against each other without acknowledgement. In late 2018, 3 unrelated reports are filed within 48 hours of one another, each originating from a different department, each describing a problem that cannot be escalated because it lacks a clear category. One is a transportation notice about a rural road that briefly fails to appear on updated navigation systems despite being physically intact. Another is a utilities report describing a temporary loss of pressure in an underground line that serves no structures currently mapped. The third is a sheriff's call log noting a welfare check request for a residence that does not exist in county records but is described with unusual specificity by the caller. Each report is handled independently. Each is closed without resolution. No one compares them. No one is tasked with synthesis. This is not negligence. It is a structure doing what it was built to do. Around the same time, a graduate student working on a thesis about historical land use patterns stumbles onto a peculiar absence. While analyzing digitized plat maps across decades, she notices a repeating void, a blank space that migrates slightly between editions but never fills in. It is not labeled as water. It is not labeled as a forest. It is simply unaccounted for. She brings this to her advisor, who suggests it is a scanning artifact. She accepts this explanation until she overlays hand-drawn survey notes from an earlier era and finds the same void described indirectly through adjustments rather than markings. She submits a query to the county requesting clarification. The request is acknowledged and then forgotten. The student eventually changes her research focus. The anomaly remains, undocumented and unchallenged. In early 2019, a contractor hired to repair a collapsed culvert near the boundary reports an unusual delay in completing the job. The site appears straightforward. The repair should take a day. Instead, the crew works for 3 days and cannot agree on what they accomplished. Measurements taken at the start do not match those taken at the end. The culvert appears fixed, then compromised, then fixed again. The foreman attributes this to fatigue and weather. He submits the paperwork. The photographs attached to the report show the same section of ground from different angles, but the background does not align. Trees appear closer in one image, farther in another. No one notices. The project is marked complete. The county's pattern of response remains unchanged. Avoidance is still effective. But avoidance requires vigilance, and vigilance degrades over time. Personnel change. Institutional memory thins. The sheriff's map, once actively suppressed, now exists in a liminal state. It is neither destroyed nor referenced. It is simply waiting. In mid-2019, the locked drawer is opened by accident during an office renovation. A clerk tasked with cataloging contents finds the file and, unaware of its status, returns it to archives. This act restores the map to circulation without intention. The system registers its presence again. Almost immediately, small discrepancies begin to appear. Index numbers shift. Cross-references misalign. The file resists being slotted back into place. It is as if its absence had been maintaining equilibrium. Within weeks, a historian requests access to the archive for unrelated research and encounters the file. He is struck by its tone. The language is precise but strained. He copies several pages for later review. He does not copy the map. He does not notice it until afterward. When he returns to retrieve it, the map is missing. The file remains. The map does not. The historian assumes someone else has removed it. He does not pursue the matter. In 2020, global disruption shifts attention away from local anomalies. Resources are redirected. Oversight becomes remote. Physical presence decreases. The land experiences less scrutiny than it has in decades. For a time, everything quiets. Reports diminish. Complaints drop. The void on the map stabilizes. This lull is deceptive. It is not a resolution. It is accumulation deferred. When activity resumes, it does so unevenly. In late 2021, a group of volunteers conducting a historical walking tour deviates slightly from the planned route due to fallen branches. They enter a section of forest not included in the itinerary. One volunteer later describes a sensation of recognition without memory. He cannot explain it. He simply knows the place feels referenced. He steps away from the group briefly and finds a line of stones partially embedded in the soil. They form a rough angle, not enough to suggest a structure, but enough to imply intention. He calls the others. By the time they arrive, the stones appear scattered and indistinct. The moment passes. The tour continues. The volunteer does not include the incident in his report. He later admits he could not find the words. As the predicted interval closes, anticipation sharpens among those who study patterns rather than events. They note that manifestation does not require belief. It requires alignment, enough attention, enough documentation, enough insistence on fixing location and meaning. The sheriff's original map was such an alignment. Its reappearance, even briefly, may have been sufficient to restart the cycle. The bone house does not need to exist physically to exert influence. It exists as a corrective force, responding to attempts at permanence. Every map drawn invites erasure. Every measurement invites drift. The system's current challenge is not whether the structure will return, but whether the conditions that allow it to appear have already been met. The final movement of this case is not marked by discovery or disappearance, but by decision. Whether to look again, whether to redraw the map, whether to leave the drawer closed. The next part follows the consequences of that choice, made quietly, without consensus, by people who believe they are acting independently. By early 2022, the file has settled back into archives without the map, a compromised state that feels stable precisely because it is incomplete. The absence is now structural rather than anomalous. Systems function more smoothly when the map is not present, but its influence lingers in indirect ways. Requests involving the area take longer to process. Reviews loop back for clarification. Decisions defer themselves. The machinery of governance slows not because of resistance, but because certainty has become expensive. In March of that year, a routine audit of archival access logs reveals an oddity. The file has been accessed multiple times by different users within a short span, each for unrelated reasons. No single researcher stands out. What stands out is timing. The accesses cluster around the same days, often within hours of one another. This pattern mirrors earlier cycles noted in field data and environmental reports. The archivist flags it, not as a concern, but as a curiosity. The flag prompts a brief internal discussion about whether to restrict access to historically sensitive materials. The discussion ends without action. Restriction would require justification. Justification would require explanation. Explanation would require confronting what no one wants to define. Outside the archive, physical changes continue subtly. A new trail marker appears near the boundary, installed as part of a routine update. Within weeks, it is reported missing. It is replaced. It disappears again. On the third installation, the marker remains, but its arrow points in a direction that does not correspond to any trail. The maintenance crew assumes a prank and corrects it. The next day, the arrow points wrong again. Eventually, the marker is removed entirely. No one files a report. The absence feels preferable to inconsistency. In April, a land survey conducted for a private sale adjacent to the old zone produces conflicting results. The boundaries described in the deed do not align with current measurements. The discrepancy is small but persistent. The surveyor recalculates. The error shifts but does not resolve. He submits a note indicating possible historical boundary drift due to earlier mapping inaccuracies. The sale proceeds with an amended description. The land changes hands without clarity about what, exactly, has been transferred. This is how ownership adapts to uncertainty. In May, a group of researchers finally crosses paths. A historian, a geologist, and a data analyst meet at a conference and discover overlapping interests through casual conversation. They realize they have all been studying different expressions of the same phenomenon without naming it. They exchange notes cautiously. They avoid specifics. They speak in abstractions. Still, a picture forms. They agree to collaborate informally, to compare timelines rather than locations. Their shared spreadsheet reveals a pattern that none had seen alone. Peaks in anomaly reports correspond not to fixed intervals, but to periods of intensified documentation. When attention increases, instability follows. When attention fades, the system stabilizes. The bone house, if it can be called that, is not an object, but a response. In June, the temporary sheriff from years earlier is contacted by one of the researchers who has traced the file's recent movement. The former sheriff declines to comment. He says only that some things are safer when left without coordinates. He does not elaborate. He does not need to. By summer, local folklore begins to shift. Stories once told as warnings become framed as puzzles. Online forums speculate. Maps are shared. Coordinates are proposed. Each proposal contradicts the last. The more people try to fix the location, the less agreement there is. This diffusion of certainty acts as a buffer. The phenomenon thrives on precision. Vagueness starves it. In August, a storm damages several trees near the boundary. Cleanup crews report finding nothing unusual. But a drone survey conducted afterward captures a fleeting image, a rectangular shadow cast at an angle inconsistent with the surrounding canopy. The shadow appears in only one frame. Subsequent passes show nothing. The image is dismissed as an artifact. The file name is overwritten. The shadow persists only in memory, unreferenced and unverified. As the year closes, the collaborative researchers face a dilemma. Publishing their findings would increase attention. Withholding them would preserve stability, but sacrifice understanding. They debate privately. There is no ethical framework for this decision. They are not suppressing truth. They are managing consequences. Ultimately, they choose restraint. They circulate their conclusions among a small circle, framed as a cautionary model rather than a revelation. The model suggests that some anomalies are not errors to be corrected, but equilibria to be maintained. That certain questions destabilize the systems that ask them. This choice mirrors those made before by the sheriff, by clerks, and by unnamed supervisors who chose silence over certainty. The bone house does not need to vanish again. It has already achieved its function. It has taught the system how to behave around absence. The final part of this story does not introduce new evidence. It examines what remains after evidence has been managed, redirected, and allowed to decay. By 2023, the county's relationship with the area has settled into a pattern that feels permanent because it is self-sustaining. There are no active investigations, no standing warnings, no formal restrictions beyond those that can be justified through ordinary administrative language. And yet, the behavior remains precise. Routes are planned with an extra margin. Patrol schedules bend subtly around the old zone. Equipment upgrades are tested elsewhere first. None of this is written down as policy. It exists as a habit, passed laterally rather than vertically, learned by doing rather than instruction. This is how institutions carry memory without record. The archive file, now thinner than it once was, sits among thousands of others. It is accessed rarely. When it is, the access leaves no immediate consequence. No letters arrive. No anomalies spike. The system has learned how much attention it can tolerate. The map never returns, not physically, but its logic does. People no longer ask where the structure was. They ask when it appears. Even that question is usually framed indirectly, embedded in scheduling decisions, maintenance cycles, and data review intervals. Time has replaced space as the variable of concern. In late 2023, a graduate seminar examines a theoretical model describing environments that resist stable representation. The model is abstract, drawn from multiple case studies without naming any. One student asks whether such environments can be changed, stabilized, or dismantled. The instructor pauses before answering. He says only that some systems are not problems to be solved, but boundaries to be respected. The discussion moves on. No one notes the phrasing. Meanwhile, physical traces continue to surface and vanish without escalation. A hiker finds a single bone near a trailhead, cleaned and unmarked. It could belong to any animal. It could have arrived there by any means. The hiker leaves it. Later, it is gone. No report is filed. In another instance, a drone operator captures an image of what looks like an outline beneath the forest floor, a subtle difference in vegetation growth forming a rough rectangle. The operator assumes pareidolia. The image is not flagged. Vegetation patterns shift with seasons. The outline dissolves. These moments are no longer anomalies, they are background noise. The system has learned not to amplify them. The sheriff's original error was believing that documentation confers control. His map did not capture the structure. It invited it. Every line drawn was an offer. Every coordinate fixed was a request for repetition. The subsequent century has been an education in refusal. Not denial, but restraint. The structure does not need to be hidden. It needs to be uninvited. The final documents associated with the case do not describe a disappearance. They describe a correction. Files that once referenced missing materials are now clean. Databases show continuity. The absence has been normalized. To an outsider, nothing appears unresolved. This is the most effective form of containment. The bone house, if it ever existed as a building, no longer matters. What matters is the behavior it provoked and the adjustments it enforced. It taught the system how to live with uncertainty without collapsing into obsession. It revealed the limits of measurement. It exposed the danger of insisting that everything be locatable, nameable, and repeatable. In the end, the structure did not vanish. It was outgrown. Or perhaps it simply moved to the margins, where attention thins and patterns blur. There is no final warning, no concluding discovery, only a quiet equilibrium maintained through practice rather than decree. The forest continues to be mapped, trails continue to be maintained, People continue to pass through without incident. And somewhere, in the layers beneath record and memory, the conditions that once allowed a structure to appear remain dormant, waiting not for belief, but for alignment. If these deep-dive investigations into what records reveal, conceal, and quietly correct matter to you, subscribe to follow the next case, where absence itself leaves a paper trail and the map is never the territory.